try to live up to that introduction. Thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here tonight and really glad to see such a wonderful turnout for such an important issue. And I'm not used to speaking to people behind me, but anyway. I want to first just thank Tom and Julia? Sorry, for doing the ceremony this evening, and especially Indigenous Environmental Network has been so crucial in the struggle for climate justice for decades that I really want to honor that. And also the rising I Don't Know More movement, which is, you know, building this incredible Indigenous movement in Canada. So in 4 days' time, the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon is having a closed-door climate summit for the world's leaders to discuss ambitions about climate change for the upcoming climate conferences, they call them COPs, for the upcoming climate COPs in Lima, Peru, and Paris, France. And I just quickly want to mention, if you want more details about what I'm going to talk about here, you can go online and find a paper that we wrote called The Green Shock Doctrine. It details a lot of these things and has lots of references if you want more. I'm going to try to put into context the reason for the actions that are happening this weekend, and especially the problem of the corporate capture of the United Nations that Jill touched on. I've been attending the UN Framework Conventions on Climate Change since 2004 in Buenos Aires, and the reason that I got involved in them actually wasn't because of climate change, but because of the issue that I'm most passionate about and work most of the time on, which is genetically engineered trees. And what had happened was the year before, the UN had decided that genetically engineered trees, which are a horrific invention and could potentially destroy all of the forests on the planet if they're commercialized, which they aren't yet, thank goodness. Anyway, they had said that they would be great to put into carbon offset forestry plantations, and that would be just wonderful. So we went there, very young, naive, and thinking, okay, well, we'll just tell the UN they're wrong, and they'll change their minds, and it'll be all fine. So we went there, and we found out that actually the reason that genetically engineered trees had been approved for these carbon offset forestry plantations was because Norway had tried to get them banned. And they couldn't, because China and Brazil want to grow, or were already growing genetically engineered trees, so they blocked it. So the GE trees were allowed because they couldn't be banned. We were incredulous. This is the UN? Really? Okay. So that's what they do. The UN is this dysfunctional group of people that get very little done except for what the what their corporate masters tell them to do. And this became apparent more and more over the years. The next one was in Montreal, and then there was one in Nairobi. And it really came to a head in Bali, Indonesia in 2007. And that's where Climate Justice Now was born. So at the Climate Convention in Bali in 2007, that was where the UN announced their RED program, which stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. And they launched it in partnership with the World Bank. In fact, Robert Zoellick, Mr. Project for a New American Century, Mr. Iraq War, Mr. Global Domination, announced this RED program. So suddenly this person who wants U.S. hegemony around the planet wants to protect forests because he's concerned about the climate. Huh, that's interesting. So we looked into a little more, and what people found out throughout that climate conference was, in fact, the UN was not really interested in protecting forests. They were interested in creating an excuse not to cut emissions. And they were interested in an excuse to take over the last intact ecological reserves on the planet, which were already being taken care of by the people who depended on them. The forest-dependent people, the peasant farmers, and the indigenous people. But they weren't making a lot of money off of those lands, and those lands could certainly be put to better use by storing the carbon that Chevron wants to put out in their oil refineries. But in order for Chevron to claim credit for that, they have to own those forests, or at least be paying for the carbon that they store. So RED was born. And the indigenous people in Bali said, hey, you know, these are our lands. You're going to at least talk to us about this? No. They were not included in the conversation. They were not included in the discussions. They were shut out completely. And so they held a spontaneous protest in front of the media tent. And the media, which you have to understand, at that time, these climate conferences were tediously boring. The negotiations were painful, pulling teeth. The media would just sit there and be sweating in the media tent, trying to figure out some way to spin this to be interesting. So when this group of 100 indigenous people in traditional garb showed up outside of the media tent, they went crazy. The media attention got covered all over the world. An AP photograph was picked up in more than 100 different newspapers. So that was the real inspiration behind Climate Justice Now, seeing the power of this indigenous protest, people protesting in solidarity with the indigenous people throughout the 2 weeks of the climate conference. And out of that, we all got together and said, you know what, we really need to make this formal. We need to do something with this energy, this power that we have. And so we founded Climate Justice Now. And the reason that all of this came about started, of course, with the UN back in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit, where they decided that something should happen with climate change. And they came up with the idea of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which ultimately came up with the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, which wasn't ratified until 2005, when Russia finally came on board, and has done exactly doodly squat since then. In fact, in 2012 and 2013, emissions rose faster than at any time since 1984. So that's with a binding climate agreement that was signed, that went into force in 2005. Emissions have gone up and up. Many countries abandoned the Kyoto Protocol. Japan left it. The United States, of course, never signed on, thanks to Al Gore. So there's a great history behind why the climate justice movement emerged and why it emerged at the UN Climate Convention. So I'm going way ahead of my notes here. The next major organizing opportunity for the climate justice movement was in 2009 in Copenhagen. That was where the UN was supposed to come up with a new binding agreement that would be the second phase of the Kyoto Protocol, which was set to expire in 2012. As we all know, nothing happened. Obama waltzed in with his secretly negotiated Copenhagen Accord after the other countries had all been negotiating in good faith for a week and a half. And he dropped it on the table and he said, take it or leave it. And fortunately, Venezuela and Bolivia said, no, thank you. And it was abandoned. And in fact, I was in the media center at that time, and when Obama came out with this, the media were incredulous. In fact, they booed the teleprompters. They were so outraged. Even the media were so outraged at Obama. And after that, we started calling him Obama. But anyway, Copenhagen was going to be this major watershed moment for people to really start to realize that the UN either was or wasn't going to be the solution. Most of us agreed that it wasn't. So there was a mass organizing that was underway. People from around the world came to Copenhagen for a series of meetings to do this mass mobilization in Copenhagen at the talks. In Poznan, Climate Justice Now announced that there would be a mass mobilization, and the UN was kind enough to have the beginning of the Copenhagen climate talks be on November 30th, 2009. That doesn't ring bells. That was the 10th anniversary of the WTO shutdown in Seattle. Yeah. So we started calling the UN the World Carbon Trading Organization because of their market-based infatuation, and began organizing around that theme. And we announced it in Poznan, and the very next day, the UN changed the date to a week later. But the Poznan meetings were really powerful. Again, we fought back against RED. We stood in solidarity with indigenous people. And the Climate Justice Now came out with a statement that was called Radical New Agenda Needed to Achieve Climate Justice. I'm just going to read a quick excerpt from it. It states, we will not be able to stop climate change if we do not change the neoliberal and corporate-based economy which stops us from achieving sustainable societies. Corporate globalization must be stopped. Private investors circled the talks like vultures, swooping in on every opportunity to create new profits. At least 1,500 industry lobbyists were present, some as members of country delegations. Market ideology has totally infiltrated the climate talks, and the UN negotiations are now like trade fairs hawking investment opportunities. Solutions to the climate crisis will not come in from industrialized countries and big business. Effective and enduring solutions will come from those who have protected the environment: indigenous peoples, women, peasants, family farmers, fisherfolk, forest-dependent communities, youth, and marginalized and affected communities in the global south and north. We stand at a crossroads. We call for a radical change in direction to put climate justice and people's rights at the center of these negotiations. Over 100 organizations from around the world signed that, and that was in 2008. So here we are in 2014, and not much in the UN has changed, except they've got more false solutions, geoengineering, biomass, nuclear power, all of these things that they're pushing as so-called solutions that are going to do nothing but cause more misery and pain for many people and further destruction of the environment. So in Copenhagen, 1 year later, we planned this mass mobilization. The UN was calling it Copenhagen. And we organized what was called the Reclaim Power Action, which was a mass march out from the UN to the outside, and the idea was to meet people who were marching to the conference from the outside, to meet in the middle for a people's assembly where we would talk about real solutions to the climate crisis. The UN had other ideas. The Danish police attacked the people marching out from the climate conference. They beat people, they pushed people back, they were quite violent, many people were bloodied. And on the outside, the people who were marching in got attacked by the police. They were thrown in jail and charged with terrorism. This was what the UN had become. The UN had become the new WTO. They surrounded themselves with fences. They didn't allow people to participate. It got worse after Copenhagen, of course, after there had been this mass action. And Climate Justice Now came out with another statement in Copenhagen calling for system change, not climate change. In fact, the title was Call for System Change, Not Climate Change, Unites Global Movement. It stated, the Climate Justice Now coalition, alongside other networks, was united here at COP15 in the call for system change, not climate change. In contrast, the Copenhagen Climate Conference itself demonstrated that real solutions, as opposed to false market-based solutions, will not be adopted until we overcome the existing unjust political and economic system. Government and corporate elites here in Copenhagen made no attempt to satisfy the expectations of the world. False solutions and corporations completely co-opted the United Nations process. Virtually every proposal discussed in Copenhagen was based on a desire to create opportunities for profit rather than reduce emissions. The only discussions of real solutions in Copenhagen took place in the social movements. Our demonstrations, organized together with Danish trade unions, movements, and NGOs, mobilized more than 100,000 people in Denmark to press for climate justice, while social movements around the world mobilized hundreds of thousands more in local climate justice demonstrations. Copenhagen will be remembered as an historic event for global social movements. It will be remembered along with Seattle and Cancun as a critical moment when the diverse agendas of many social movements coalesced and became stronger, asking in one voice for system change, not climate change. So that's sort of a little of the history of what has brought us here today. The UN went on in the next several climate COPs in Cancun and in Durban to increase their repressive approach. They routinely arrested people, they beat journalists, they got completely out of control, the UN security of these things. And ultimately, as Jill pointed out, in Durban there was a mass sit-in, and those of us who refused to comply with security were thrown out and banned for life from the UN climate conference, which, quite frankly, was fine. They said I could apologize and come back, but I don't really want to do that. And then, the next year, the UN went to Doha. Doha is where the WTO went after Seattle, to hide in the desert, where they don't have to deal with protests. So the UN went to Doha. And now they're here in New York, and I'm very excited about what's going to be happening this weekend around this event. And we've seen the power that comes from people when they refuse to obey, when they take on the power structure through creative and direct action and fight back. We saw it in the movement against the Vietnam War, we saw it in the civil rights movement, and we just powerfully witnessed it in Ferguson. People around the world are putting their lives on the line to defend their communities and their lands against the ravages of climate change and false solutions like biofuels. Peasants in Honduras and indigenous peoples in Indonesia are rising up against oil palm plantations in the face of violent repression and murder. Farmers in Mexico are fighting industrial wind farms. Innu people in Quebec are mobilizing to stop massive hydroelectric dams that will drown their ancestral lands. Tupiniquim and Guarani peoples in Brazil cut down industrial eucalyptus plantations to reestablish their traditional villages. And when the corporations burnt them down, they came back and rebuilt them again. There are rural women in Kenya relearning how to grow food and forage for traditional foods to become independent from food aid, which is often in the form of GMOs. La Via Campesina is organizing peasant farmers around the world who are practicing traditional agriculture, feeding people while cooling the planet. And there are thousands of such inspirational examples. So I ask you all, what are you going to be doing this week to be part of the movement for change? There is an amazing opportunity, not just at the march on Sunday, but at an action on Monday that's been called Flood Wall Street. Thousands of people will be taking their outrage and demands directly to the source, directly to the bankers, to the financiers, to the power elite. The people who are driving the climate crisis will have to deal with it in their own homes. There's going to be a direct action training, incidentally, if you want to be part of that. Immediately after this, look for the people with the Flood Wall Street signs in the back, and they will take you over next door to where the training will be. I hope everyone will go if you haven't been trained before, or if you have, as a reminder.
Also, Occupy the UN as well.
And Occupy the UN is happening as well, which is happening tomorrow throughout the day. I'm sorry, not tomorrow, Sunday throughout the day. You can meet at the Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza to be in touch with that. And the reason why I think these things are so important is because as those of us who've been involved in the movement for change, who've spent time in jail, we understand that there's great power in resisting. There's great power in saying no. There's great power in standing up for what you believe. And there is great power in direct action. Direct action is the antidote for despair.